Okay, I've sort of touched on this already. How do you prep for your lessons so that you're set up for success? How long does it take for you to prep? I guess, how do I prep for my lessons? I already talked about, the lesson planning process, but I guess you got to start with the syllabus, right? The syllabus is the document that tells you what you're expected to teach and what your students are expected to learn. And mathematics teachers, and not only mathematics teachers, but frequently mathematics teachers often rely on a textbook. Textbooks are super helpful. I really appreciate textbooks, and they're enormously valuable to provide a framework of someone who's done a lot of thinking and planning, and who can, you can stand on the shoulders of giants and pick up where they left off, right? But textbooks are not a substitute for the syllabus. For starters, there is no textbook that is going to address every single element of the syllabus, and often you'll find most textbooks will address parts of learning that are not in the syllabus because they want to extend and enrich students, right? So you cannot rely on the textbook itself to be the guide and the direction for what your students need to learn. It should be something which you use to support your interpretation of the syllabus. And you sort of implied here, but I should state it out loud and explicitly, have lots of different textbooks if you're going to use a textbook, because each of them has a different perspective or a different interpretation on the way the syllabus works. I remember when I was at school and I took English Extension 2, which is that unit of English where you're doing a lot of composition and writing, and whether you're into poetry or short stories and all that kind of thing, you're writing something for yourself and not just reading what other people have written. And my English Extension 2 teacher, she said to me, if all you read is one author, like you've got your favorite author and you just read them over and over again, just look at their books, right? Then when you write, you will be a poor imitation of that one author, because you don't have all the knowledge and background that author has, but all you can do is kind of mimic what they're doing, and you won't do a very good job. And that's kind of like what happens if you are just using a single textbook. You will be a poor mimic of the person who wrote that textbook. My English teacher then went on and said, if you read 5 textbooks and then you start writing, you will sound confused because you're trying to draw in and combine all these elements from different authors who are often taking on different styles, but you don't know which parts of them work together yet. And so you will produce something when you write, which is kind of this mishmash of incoherent babble, right? And you're like, this person feels like they're got this split personality as they're writing. And so you're confused if you have a whole bunch of different authors. You might say, well, what's the point then? My English Extension 2 teacher finished it by saying, if you read 100 authors, then when you write, you will start to discover your own voice, which is kind of paradoxical, but if you think about it, it makes sense, right? When you read really widely, and if bring it back to the teaching analogy, if you have lots of different sources and points of inspiration and more experienced or knowledgeable colleagues who you turn to and you ask them questions, you will start to get a better sense for how you, as yourself, as an individual teacher with your own particular personality and way of teaching, you work out the way that makes sense for you and for your classes, and you'll be able to interpret the syllabus accurately and teach it in a way that coheres with the style that makes sense for you. So how do I prep for my lessons? I go to the syllabus, I use all the resources, I draw on the knowledge of others. Observe your colleagues, right? Don't just ask them questions and have them answer. Watch them do things. There's a whole lot of interesting studies about the differences between novices and experts. And one of the interesting things about experts, people who are really good at doing things by practice and tens of thousands of hours of developing that expertise, is that sometimes experts are unable to articulate the things that make them expert. There's this famous story of a chess master who, when interviewed and asked about, how do you know, can you explain to me why you choose to do this move next when your opponent has done this, right? And the chess master replied, I don't know. I just look and it's obvious to me. And many expert, experienced teachers will say this to you. They just kind of know. They develop an intuition, right? So sometimes you can't just ask questions. You have to see them do the thing and watch them question or formatively assess as their lesson goes by. They might not realize they're doing it, but as experts they are, and when you observe them, you'll be able to see and pick up on those things. So that's part of lesson preparation, right? If you're like, I don't know how to teach this particular concept, if you get the opportunity, watch someone else teach it. Now, this last question that's part of this, which says, how long does it take for you to prep? This is very much a question that is, how long is a piece of string, right? For me, I think about that phrase, a work of art is never completed. It is only abandoned. You can never step back from an artwork and say, it's finished. There is no more that you can do to improve this thing. And a lesson is very much the same. It is never, there's nothing more I could do to this lesson to sharpen it, to make it more snappy, to make it clearer, to think of another illustration that would help my students understand. You can always keep on working on your lesson, but there comes a point where you have to say, the bell is gone. I've got to get up and go teach this thing now. Or more likely, it's 11:30 at night. I need to get to bed and stop preparing this lesson because otherwise I will go into school sleep deprived the next day, and that is not good for anyone, right? So at a certain point, you just have to stop. There have been lessons in my life where I have probably spent 3 or 4 hours on a single lesson trying to really wrap my head around how does this thing work? Like, I just couldn't understand it for myself and work out, let alone, how to teach it to someone else. In some ways, I've gone into lessons where I couldn't have those 3 hours. I just had to prepare this lesson in 10 minutes, and it wasn't a very good lesson, and I worked that out when I went to teach it, and the plan just kind of fell apart, or the group work didn't work, or I would give an explanation to students, and then I would just be met by blank looks or confusion, or I would ask them, do you have any questions? And no one would raise their hand, but then 30 seconds later when I set them all to work, they're all just getting the wrong answer to the questions because I didn't give a very good explanation, right? So sometimes you teach a bad lesson, and in some ways, that teaching of a bad lesson is part of your prep for the next time you teach that. So when you say, like, how long does it take for you to prep? This is why it's an indeterminate question, because it's as long as it takes, and you keep preparing that lesson as you keep on teaching it year after year after year and make it better and sharpen it. So, some concepts are easy to wrap your head around at the beginning, but then as you teach them, or as you realize that there are more conceptual building blocks underneath this lesson that happened prior to the lesson that you didn't realize were there, that you thought, I've finished playing this lesson, it looks pretty good, but then after you teach it, you realize, oh no, I needed to include more things in that lesson. I needed to start teaching earlier and not assume that they know these things. You just go back and you rework that, right? So yeah, some lessons will be very quick. Sometimes you get given a lesson to look after, a class to look after, and you have no time to prepare. You just have to do your best with the students. I mean, there's no point pretending with your students, like go in there and pretend like you're an expert at something which you have not spent any effort or time preparing. In my experience, you just kind of be transparent about it and say, look guys, I just got handed this lesson, we're gonna work it out together, right? But then work on it harder for next time. And sometimes it takes, I might be reading a book that's about teaching, and that book takes me 2 weeks to go all the way through, and at the end of it, I come up with a better understanding of the concept or the skill that I want to teach, or the particular style or pedagogy that I'm going to use when teaching it. Was that part of my lesson preparation? Did that one lesson take 2 weeks to prepare? Well, in a sense, yes, but in a sense, no, because what that's doing is investing in me as an overall teacher, and it changes the way I prepare all my lessons, right? So I find this question very difficult to answer. It's very variable, and I hope that makes sense. What do you do to make your lessons interactive and engaging while you're teaching up the front of the classroom? Well, the first thing to respond to that is you don't always teach at the front of the classroom. I know if you watch my YouTube channel, the sense that you will get is that I teach up the front of the classroom a lot. And I do, but you don't get to see, because of child protection and privacy reasons, what happens after I stop the recording and then I go sit beside my students, or I get them to work in small groups and I get beside them and I try and understand what's going on, what things they understand and what they don't understand, and which ways I can keep on helping them, right? So you keep your lessons interactive and engaging, firstly, by not being up the front of the classroom the whole time. But secondly, when you are up the front of the classroom, there are lots of obvious things you can do to make your lessons interactive and engaging. Think about how you ask questions in the middle of a lesson, right? There's a great article, you should Google it actually, which is called Never Say What a Student Can Say. Never say what a student can say, which is to point out, if you're up the front of the classroom, and you're going through an explanation, and you reach a part of the lesson which is based on or builds on a concept that the students have learned previously, then You shouldn't say that. You should draw on your students to say that. You can say something as simple as, okay, now we're up to this line. Now, hold on a second. This looks familiar. Does anyone remember this from last week or from last lesson? And then someone is going to stick up their hand, or you might want to, cold call a student if you know them well enough and you think it's the right call in that context to get them to elicit their knowledge. You want them to be awake constantly. You want to be able to assess them all the way through the lesson. So, for example, when I'm at the front of the classroom, you might ask something like, or rather you might equip your students with what we call mini whiteboards, right? So these are like A4 size, a little whiteboard that you can write on, you can rub it out immediately, and you might say to students, okay, we're thinking about prime numbers today. Can you write down for me as many prime numbers as you can think of in 20 seconds, right? And so they all write their prime numbers big enough on their interactive whiteboards, not interactive, they're mini whiteboards so you can see them. And then you say, all right, everyone, can you hold up your whiteboards? Now, you can then look at the front of the classroom and you can see everyone. You don't have to wait for someone to stick up their hand and then you ask that individual student who is probably the student who is confident and knows the answer to give you an answer, and then you say, oh, I feel like everyone knows. Well, maybe everyone doesn't know, and you can see that if you're looking at everybody's whiteboards and you realize, yep, I've got 5 students out of 30 who really know what prime numbers are, and then I've got a bunch of students who clearly have no idea what prime numbers are, and I need to sort of address that in my teaching, right? So in terms of interactivity and engagement, you can use questions. There are smart ways to use technology, and I don't just mean devices. I think mini whiteboards are a technology to be able to get insight into what your students are thinking and how to adapt your lesson accordingly. So hopefully these are some helpful suggestions along the way.